just a short thing to show you the structure of it. But 8 pages, I just couldn't get on the screen. Battleship. U.S. battleship is usually described from its foreign counterparts by its heavy gun armament, sturdy protection, relatively slow speed. 3 distinct subtypes, 27 mixed battery ships built 1888 to 1908, 22 all big gun dreadnoughts, 1910 to 1923, and 10 fast battleships, 1937-1944, stricken from the Navy's lists in January 1995. That means we don't have battleships anymore. As ship killers, the battleships saw little action, yet they ultimately justified their existence in important subsidiary missions, the most significant being gunfire support for troops ashore. The reason why it goes for 8 pages, well, let me show you the structure of it first. Oh, there's so much here. First of all, unlike the science one, we have to distinguish what this word or this concept might mean in different cultures. Because what's a battleship to us might not be a battleship to the Germans or the Russians or whoever. So that's where sturdy protection and slow speed come in. 3 distinct subtypes, and the subtypes are distinguished by when they were made, when they were used. History dictionaries are going to show you how something has changed over time. Not just different across cultures, but different over time. You're not going to find that. You know, DNA is the same kind of DNA people were futzing with 50 years ago. It's not a different concept. Battleships are. They're quite different which kind of battleship you're talking about. The biggest difference, the biggest page user wasn't on those took considerable space. It's the part down here. They ultimately justified their existence. The reason is because this is history, guys. History, I've already told you, is about argument. And in this case, the argument was, do we need battleships or not? And not all the naval experts agreed. Some of them thought battleships were really terrific because if you built this huge fighting machine, it could knock any other ship out of the water with big enough armament. But of course, it was going to be slow. And so the people over here would say, how will it turn around? What if the other ship just shoots around to its other side and shoots? What's it going to do? That kind of thing. And so, for example, in World War II, the argument had been won by the folks who said, this ship is going to be great. It'll blow all the other ships out of the water. Turned out it was terrible for that. You couldn't use it for that because it wasn't nimble enough. The other group could come up with PT boats and blow it out of the water. But they found things it could do. And so a lot of the battles that were fought in World War II were often when we were invading an island or invading land, and they would be offshore D-Day. They're offshore shooting in, and they were terrific for stuff like that. History people, am I wrong on this? That's right in the definition, because the definition in science is going to tell you certain structural kinds of things and things that are going to be culturally neutral. And in the history dictionary, they're going to have to tell you about those cultural differences, those time differences, and those arguments. They're different, the nature of the definitions. And so it became really clear to me in that experience, in a biology class, in a history class, in a literature class, kids should be using not just a dictionary occasionally, but technical dictionaries, technical resources like that. But Tim, we're not required to do that. I don't care if you're required to. If you really want kids to understand these subjects and to start to get what's going on in these fields of study and what people are doing, you want them to be exposed to that kind of thing. This scientist was surprised that the kids didn't know that kind of thing, and so she started teaching that. I have enough time. We're gonna break at about 11:30 for lunch. We'll have an hour for lunch, and we'll come back. I think I can do this next little segment in the space I have. I hope I can. I've really come to believe that the differences that I'm talking about here are cultural differences. That people don't just get sorted into these different disciplines by accident. That people sort of choose up what they're most comfortable with, or what makes the greatest sense of them. At schools, we kind of sort kids into these categories. That story I told earlier about the woman who became an English teacher, because from the time she was about 8 or 9, people said, you should be an English teacher, is not uncommon. What we really need to start doing, though, is take that kid who everybody thinks would be a great English teacher and say, I bet you could be a good engineer. You can read literature on weekends. You could really contribute to the creation of new kinds of batteries or new kinds, you're really smart. We could get you into chemistry. We could pull you in because I can show you how we think and how we approach the world. I was doing a workshop last year, 2-day workshop. First day, 80 social studies, middle school social studies teachers in Ohio. Day 2, 80 middle school science teachers going through this stuff. And I misplanned the first day. Didn't get through everything I'd planned on. I had to hurry at the end. I was discouraged about it. You know what it's like when you blow a lesson or not entirely happy with a lesson. And I was talking to my wife on the phone that night, and I said, man, I'm worried about tomorrow. Given that today didn't quite work like I planned, and she said, well, who are you talking to tomorrow? I said, the science people. She says, you don't have to worry about it with the science people. I said, why not? She says, they don't talk. They're less verbal. It's the most amazing thing. And it's true. When you go through the different hallways in a school like this and find that the different groups of teachers, they really talk about different things in the lounge and so on. What I'm really suggesting to you folks is that math and science and social studies aren't just different topics or different subject matters. They're different cultural groups that are being represented. And anything that you've studied on how to move across cultures, how to work across cultures, how to make folks in your schools feel comfortable or like they're part of it, frankly, those enculturation and acculturation kinds of things really make sense here. Let me show you what sense I've been able to make, and I think I'm going to start with a different one. I can come back. I'll start there today. What I'd like to describe to you, based on the research we did, some of the implications of these cultural differences, what it is that these different cultures are thinking about or planning that are important in terms of what we give to kids. And the reason I wanted to start with history is because I've already said a lot about it, so I can get through this slide really quickly. I told you, for example, that in history, the interpretation of argument and of authors and sourcing are central to the enterprise. That those experts are constantly sourcing the material and considering bias. I even showed you how that gets built right into the definitions of the words and the technical text. It's also true in history that a lot of times history tells you the history or expresses the argument through narrative history. It tells you a series of stories. And you have to learn to see history as this argument based on partial evidence, that the narratives are more than facts, that there are reasons why they're assembled the way they are, and so on. One of the things that the history teachers made very clear, the historians made very clear to us when we looked at textbooks and stuff. Now, they weren't anti-textbook. They thought textbooks were fine. But they also believed you couldn't possibly teach history with a textbook, or a single textbook, let's say it that way. If you had a set of textbooks where kids were reading different textbooks and stuff, that'd be okay. If you had a textbook and a bunch of primary documents, that would be okay. But they believed that a single text approach to history was antithetical to history. It didn't understand what history was about. It didn't express any understanding of that. And so to the historians, boy, recognizing that person behind the text and reading those stories, not as stories, but as arguments, and this idea of multi-text that you need to corroborate, those are not small ideas. Their culture is very big on that. One of the things we saw with our historians is, and other studies have confirmed this, no matter what they read, they tend to read everything in pretty much the fashion I've described. Not just history, they read everything like that. And so, if they sit down and read something, it's like, who says this? When did they come up with this? They do that kind of thing. Now the scientists, and in our case, the scientists were chemists. The scientists believed that reading was very important. They told us that text provides knowledge that allows prediction of how the world works. It was important for people to gain a full understanding of the need for experiments and to understand scientific processes. Boy, living through what we're living through right now, you can certainly see where they're coming from, right? But boy, oh boy, there were some things that they shared with us that were pretty different than what we heard from the other folks. So for example, Cindy had done these think-alouds with the chemists. And one of the things, when the chemists were doing their think-alouds, the word author never came up. They never mentioned the author. I told you how frequent it was with the historians. They never mentioned it. Cindy told them about the historians, and she probed. She wanted to know, do you guys think about author? And they thought, and they said, well, you know, there's so much scientific information, we can't possibly read everything. And so what we do, we know who's at the best labs, we know who's doing the best work, we seek out their work and we read that, but then they added, but then you have to put that out of your mind and focus on the text. And so they use author as a selection problem. This is how I determine whether it's worth reading. So, if the Q group comes out and says masks are dangerous, we're probably not going to read that. If, one of the big labs comes out with a study on it, that they're going to look at. So that's the distinction. So they used author, but it's strictly to select. One day when we were looking at the textbooks, I did something really stupid. Imagine that there are all these people gathered in a room, there are all these textbooks on the tables, everybody's got, facing different ways and looking at textbooks and then different conversations. And these books, I don't know I don't know anything about the series or the publishers or whatever, but these books are not only fat, but they've got incredible illustrations and three-dimensional drawings and photographs and just, they're illustrated beyond belief. And I turned to one of the scientists and I said, tell me about, all this, and I'm trying to think of the word I used, but it was a word that said all this sort of extra stuff. And he almost took my head off. He said, you don't understand. What we're trying to communicate in science is we're trying to describe real things. This is how I'll draw this distinction between math that I said math was doing imaginary. They come up with these imaginary universes that turn to be hugely useful. The scientists are trying to describe the real world, and they're trying to describe it as exactly as possible. And what they find is that language is not sufficient. It doesn't allow you to accurately describe the world so that other people can understand it. So they always try to, when they understand something, try to express it 3 different ways. They try to express it, in words, do their best with that. They try to express it graphically. We'll look at a bunch of graphics this afternoon. And they try to express it mathematically. And those representations sometimes add new information in. Sometimes they're repetitive, redundant. Sometimes they contradict each other, perhaps unintentionally. In fact, this became a big discussion point. The chemists told us they didn't believe somebody understood the chemistry unless they could take one form of information and turn it into one of the other forms. So, can you read that paragraph and draw the picture? Can you take that graphic and turn it into mathematical terms? Can you take those mathematical terms and write the paragraph? Because if you can't do that, you really don't get it. And they were quite staunch about that. We went looking through the content area reading books and, what do they say you should teach? None of them get into any of that kind of thing. But these guys were saying, no, that's central to how we live our lives. That's not just a minor little thing. In fact, if you take something like a doctorate in chemistry, you'll probably take a class in things like graphic representation of information. Why? Because it's really central to what they do. It's not just a little side thing. Major reading strategies for them is corroborating, but not the kind of corroborating that the historian does, where can I find 10 texts on this? It's corroborating, can I look at this graphic and look at the words and see the connection? And I'm going to surmise very few of your boys and girls actually do that. Based on my experience. I wish I could say based on study, but based on my experience. And transformation, that going from one form to another. Very, very different. And the math people, and where are my math people? Let's see the hands. Oh, goodness. You guys scare me. Wow. Well, here we go. I'll do the best I can. Remember, I was working with theoretical mathematicians. The mathematicians believed that text was important and reading was important because, in fact, the way they would say it is the truth is in the text. I said the scientists didn't mention author. Guess what? Neither did the mathematicians. But when Cindy probed with the mathematicians, their answer was something like, author? There's an author? Only a really stupid person would read a text looking for the author. The information you want is in the text, and that's going to tell you, about the quantities and proportions and processes and so on. Their notion of close reading was that you read and reread a text over and over. Math text is written to be as economic as possible because of the difficulty of it. And so, as they told us, it matters if it's an or a the. You have to read every single symbol. You have to get everything right in reading math. One of the mathematicians took Cindy over to the math library, took a book. Now, mathematicians might read a book like this maybe 15 or 20 times in their career, trying to understand it. We published our work, and I got a letter from quite a well-known mathematician thanking us. But what he was thanking us for was for explaining why his wife could read 26 books a year and he could read one. And in fact, when he raised the issue, he said, have you studied how people read in other fields of study? And I said, no, we hadn't done that. He said, I think you should, because I read everything like it's math. If I sit down and read a novel, I'm reading it that way. Rereading is a major strategy. You won't find that in the content area reading books, but you will in what mathematicians actually do. There are studies showing that mathematicians cheat on this. What I was saying, there are studies showing that they can be biased readers, that they notice who wrote a text and get pulled by it, but their ideal is that you shut the author out altogether. You try not to be influenced. And so I can't tell you that they're perfect at it, but that's what they strive for. That's the honest description of it. Precision of understanding is essential. What I think you'd find if kids actually read the math book, and usually they're not even asked to, but if kids are asked to read the math book, they read it the way they read everything. They just kind of read through it. And they love math because it's so short. They think that buys them out of something. They don't understand that the reason it's so short is so the mathematician can pour over it 5 or 6 times. And again, those conversations aren't happening. I'll share some of that later today. Now, I don't have a slide about the English teachers, the literature group, to pull in this fourth humanities piece. But I can take at least one aspect of the way that these different groups read, and I can pull literature in because it's actually a public issue in the field of English studies, as some of the English teachers in the room probably know. Let me do this as kind of a visual metaphor. And I'll start with the historians. And I told you the historians read for author, right? That's central to their reading. It's a big interpretive tool that they use when they're trying to understand text. Who wrote it? When did they write it? Who did they write it for? Did they write something else on this? Did they change their mind? That kind of thing. Let me get my chemists. Not exactly where remember, they don't use author as an interpretive tool. In fact, they try to shut it out consciously. But they do use it as a selection tool. It helps them decide what's worth reading, what would be worth spending your time on. Now this room isn't big enough, maybe Lapeer, Michigan isn't big enough to show you where the mathematicians would, but I'll just put them there. I should keep walking to really show you where our mathematicians were. Because the mathematicians say, author, there's an author. And I not only don't use it interpretively, I think anyone who uses author interpretively is kind of dumb. The important part's in the text. You got to read those words. You got to read those symbols. And the English people, where do they fit on that? English teachers? The literature experts? Well, it depends where you went to school, when you trained, which textbook series you're using. Because in literature, there's been a 100-year war going on, argument, between the new critics, some of you know who the new critics are, and the more traditional literary types. The more traditional types, go back to the 19th century and such, you'd find the way that you become a literature professor or an expert in literature is you would study an author. And so I'm going to study Mark Twain. I'm going to read all of his books. I'm going to visit all of the places he's lived and worked. I'm going to go and find out about his wife and his kids and when he was sick and all these kinds of things, when he had money and when he didn't have money. And I'm going to try to match it up with his writings. And the reason I'm an expert is because I know that when he was writing this particular story, he was nowhere near the Mississippi. He was actually in Connecticut. And he was doing this from memory. And that's the reason why, and they go through that kind of thing. And the new critics came along and said, no, you shouldn't read like a historian, which would say, oh, yeah, the literature people are over here. They said, no, you should read literature like mathematics. There is no author. The author is immaterial. The only thing that matters are the words. I'll give you an example of this, just to put it in. Some of you might know that have read at one point or another New Yorker magazine. The New Yorker magazine's been around about 90 years now, and it's changed a little bit, especially in the last 20 years. But it started out as a new critical kind of an enterprise. And so, for example, here's the length they went to obscure authorship so that people would focus on the text and not on anything else. And so, for example, until the 21st century, they didn't allow table of contents in the magazine. You couldn't look at the front and say, oh, there's going to be a Hemingway story here. Let me turn, no. We're not going to tell you what's in here. You just have to turn the pages. You come to that Hemingway story, and it has the title of the story, but no author. Authors are at the end of the selections, so they won't influence you while you're reading it, like people don't know a book. They didn't allow any illustrations to go along with any of their text until, again, about 20 years ago. And the reason? Because those are interpretations that the publisher or the editors put in it. Those aren't from the author. The only thing that matters are the author's words. We want that. And so imagine this situation. You're a youngster. Let's say you're 14 years old, you're 15 years old. You come to school, and we tell you, we're not going to do any language study here, kids. We're not going to do any cultural study. But what we're going to do is we're going to put you on an airplane, and we're going to take you to Beijing. And we're going to drop you off on a street corner. And next week, we're going to come back and pick you up. Good luck. You guys get to pick the kids, so don't worry. When we pick those kids up, whoever's left, we're going to take them to Tokyo and do the same thing. And then we're going to take them to Siem Reap, and then we're going to be in Manila. And then whoever's left over, folks. Because think about what we really do. At 8 o'clock, the bell rings, and the kids go off to their social studies class, where if you're going to read this in a sophisticated way, you're going to pay a lot of attention to author in this example. And then the bell rings, and you go down the hall to your science class, where, yeah, they pay attention to author to make sure it's a legitimate scientist and it's coming from a good lab, but frankly, then you have to consciously put that out of your mind. And then you go off to the next class, where only an idiot would pay attention, and the guys in the social studies department would pay attention to the author. And then you go to your English class, and in the English class, it's going to matter which textbook you're using or which teacher you got this year. And you're supposed to negotiate that all by yourself without any guidance. You see why I'm suggesting all those things about enculturation and acculturation? We need to start telling kids not just what we want them to do or what we want them to know, but we need to start letting them understand why we're doing this and how we've arranged these things. Why a math book looks so different than a science book, for example. In a science book, scientists read, they jump from one thing to another, constantly going back between the graphics and the math and the prose. And so you'll have things like, look at figure 3.2, which is 3 pages up. Compare this with what's in appendix 4, which is 300 pages back. And what we told you in chapter 9, which is 30 pages back. And so that's how scientists read. Mathematicians, if I want you to read a table or a chart, that's the next thing in the text. If I have a formula, I don't stick the formula over on another figure. That's the next thing. It's all organized, it's structured, so you go through it in a particular way. We need to talk to kids about stuff like that. They need to understand why that's done that way, that there's a purpose to it. It's not just we're silly people. Enjoy your lunch. I'll see you at 12:35.